In Colombia, in the southern region of Caqueta, in a town called San Vicente del Caguan, some 4,000 protesters have been opposing the Emerald Oil Company's neglect and exploitation of their land and labor of these dozens and hundreds of communities which these 4,000 poor peasant protesters represent. They are so indignant and upset at the oppression and exploitation that they are going through as a result of this looting capitalist oil company that they took hostage 79 police officers and 9 employees of the oil company. A police officer and one of the protesters have lost their lives in these clashes of protests. In more recent time, the protesters have released all the hostages with the intervention of the Colombian state and Colombia's first left-wing president, President Gustavo Petro. Gustavo Petro, on his account, has been asking the protesters, of course, to release the police officers because he's the leading political head of the Colombian government and state, so he has to do that. The police, on their hand, have been trying to delegitimize the protest by saying that elements of the Revolutionary Socialist Anti-Colonial Armed Movement, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, otherwise known as FARC, have infiltrated the protesters. The protesters themselves reject this. However, the presence of tens of thousands of leftist anti-colonial socialist guerrilla in the jungles and countryside do represent a heightened, intense class struggle in the agricultural and mountainous and rural areas in Colombia, and absolutely do contribute to a more spiked and concentrated and intense class struggle generally of these poor peasant communities. The Revolutionary Armed Forces and the National Liberation Army recruit very much so disproportionately from the poorest elements of the peasantry, including native communities and Afro-Colombian communities as well. And these guerrilla do provide that to these communities which the state and the government fails to. So there is no medical clinics, there is no education, there is very little infrastructure, and it's around these things that these 4,000 poor peasants have been protesting against the oil company, demanding they build schools, demanding they build infrastructure and roads, etc. Because the argument goes, if you're going to exploit and oppress us, then some of those profits that you are stealing from us should be returned back into the community. It's a socialist type of direction of demand and advocacy. Going forward, this puts the President Petro in a difficult position because on the one hand, his leadership does kind of encourage an intensification of the class struggle, but also this then collides with the nature of the Colombian state, which is still very much embedded in the global capitalist colonial global alliance that's led by the leading European neo-colonial powers, very much Washington and Britain and Spain and others. People like Shell and British Petroleum, especially in Colombia, have been well known and infamous for their rapacious behavior in alliance and facilitated by the Colombian state and the paramilitaries and the death squads to facilitate the exploitation and oppression and frankly the genocide against the peasant communities in Colombia. So it remains an interesting dynamic and situation as we go forward there.